I have to change. Over to you, Andrew. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Peter. I hope everybody can hear me. We've had slight hiccups earlier on with the technology, as is my wont. So I'll just sort out the sharing the screen. Brilliant. Okay. This evening's talk is the bird report. So it's going to be split into 3 sections. The first is actually the review of the review, the report on the year's recording. And then the next 2 are going to be focused on areas of birding that derive from the data we've got. I'm not going to talk about what those are yet, because there's been a significant change in the way the review works, and those themes have come out of that shift. So I'd like to leave that till later so that we can sort of see where how it all comes about and why I chose those 2 topics. So if we just concentrate on the first section, which is the review of the review, if you like, and as is my wont, I'm going to I'm a bit of a numbers geek, so you will be getting quite a lot of tables and charts and things like that to go with it, as those of you who've seen my previous reports will know. So this year has seen a major change in the way we get the data, or where the data comes from that goes into the records, because this is the first year we've been able to incorporate a full year's set of data from the BTO, the British Trust for Ornithology, from their bird track and their breeding bird surveys. That has made a major change in terms of the amount and in terms of the emphasis of where the data lies. So if we have a look at just a few stats, and then I'm going to go into these in a little bit more detail. This year we actually have included in the society database just under 20,000 records. Those 3 figures that follow that are the last 3 years. Last year we saw a big uptick to just over 12,000 with the lockdown and the enthusiasm that people had for getting out into their gardens and recording. This year we've seen it bigger, and this sort of 20,000 figure is now well easily the largest sort of set of data we've had, and that's producing some interesting results in terms of what we're actually seeing. One of those that I think has almost immediately come through is the fact that we actually had 161 species recorded this year, which is the highest for a decade. And I'm absolutely convinced that looking at the data and looking at where some of the rarer species are from, that tick up of about half a dozen species has come from the BTO records. That data, that BTO data, as I say, it comes from 2 sources. It comes from Bird Track and it comes from the Breeding Bird Survey. That now represents about 55% of the data that we actually have on stored. The next largest source is actually members contributing directly, and we about a quarter of all the records that we have are now directly from members. That doesn't mean that's the only amount that members have contributed, because, for instance, I know several members who contribute to Bird Track, and we've already agreed, because you're contributing to Bird Track, you don't need to be sending me records directly. So whilst, as we'll see later, the amount of data being recorded from members has slightly dipped, that may not actually be the case, as it's coming in from other sources as well. One of our biggest contributors is, which we're very grateful for, is the Addingham Environment Group, who do a lot of surveying, a lot of work in the Addingham area. And in fact, when you actually tot up all the records that we've had from them this year, it comes to just over 1/8 of all the data that we have, 13%. So I think it's just shows what one totally focused, concentrated group can actually do and how much it can contribute. And then the last, anybody who's a mathematician will know that that means there's 7% left. And the last 7% comes from social media, primarily from 2 local WhatsApp groups, but also from a couple of Facebook sites, from any people recording stuff on Twitter and so on, which I tend to follow. And again, that includes members, as does the AEG countries, that includes Wharfedale Nats members. So you can see why that the actual proportion is more than that 25%. If we go on to actually have a look briefly at that member recording, you'll see that this year's figure looks slightly down on last year. That was, last year, as I said earlier on, was a really big year. I think it had to be down to lockdown. It had to be down to people rediscovering nature, wanting something else to do in the garden, not being able to go much further. And we did see a huge influx of records directly. You can see that that's tipped back down and is now more in line with previous years, certainly more than 2019, not as much as 2018, 2017. And you'll also see that the number of people sending data in is actually gone down as well. But again, some of those will be contributing through other sources. If we look at those records in more over a time span, that I think all that graph really shows, and I show this each year just so people can see a track, you can see how much more information we're now currently dealing with, probably getting on to double most previous years at least. Fortunately, the BTO stuff comes in a very readily manipulatable format, so it's not quite as much work as it might seem to incorporate into our information. If we look at those records more in terms of the split, when I talk about north and south as traditional north, the north basically means anywhere north of Barden Bridge, south, obviously south of Barden Bridge, and the graphs show a similar shape, you know, a gradual dipping away up to 2019 in the 2 hikes of the last couple of years. What I think is more significant perhaps is that those set of figures up in the top right-hand corner, where you will see that under north it says that between 2006 2017, between 22 and 29% of the records that we had came from the north part of our area. That was an average of 25%. And you'll see that 2018, 2019, 2020, that really dipped away. And that's, I think, almost primarily down to the loss of a bird recorder for the Upper Wharfedale Field Society, which coincided totally with that. So what this BTO data has started to do is to compensate for that. And you'll see that this year's figure, the northern figures, are up 20%. And I think that is going to be one of the things that really comes through, is that we now have a better distribution of where that data is coming from. If we break the data down even more, you'll see that what we have here, the yellow is the north of our area, the blue is the south. And what you'll see there is the number of records from each area in 2020, the number of records from 2021, and the change year on year. And you'll see that if you look at the north, the numbers are all over 100%. And the further reaching those areas are, the higher those percentages. So right up at the north end in Langstroth there, we're up to 250% more records. Still not a huge number, you know, that's 360, which when you look down at the bottom and you see how many records come in from the south, it's 20 times as many or more from the south as it is from Langstroth, but at least it's starting to better reflect the bird profile, or enable a better reflection of the bird profile. An interesting one there in the south is the fact that what we also saw with the BTO stuff coming in is a 300% increase in Bolton Abbey records, or the areas from the Bolton Abbey estates. But aside from that, the general trend is that the further south you come, the less impact that change has made. So that when you actually look at when it says the rest of the south, that's essentially the main valley between Bolton Bridge and Harewood Bridge, then you'll actually see, and where the most of the settlements are, you'll actually see it's only made about a 7% difference, which says that shows how much we're actually getting in from those areas as much as anything else. If we turn to the species, as I said in the earlier on, the species is now up to 161. What you're seeing there is the annual number of species recorded, and then the red line is a rolling 3-year trailing average. And you'll see from that that what we've actually had over the years has been a bit of a dip. And then the last 2 or 3 years started to see a bit of a rise coming up. But you'll actually notice, although I said earlier on that 161 is the most we've seen since in the last decade, you'll actually see that before that there were quite a few. And in fact, even the average in 2011 was higher than we're currently seeing. So maybe we're starting, this is not just a recording issue in terms of species drop away. There may well be a species drop overall and in actual environmental terms. Again, if we break that down, you'll see that the number of species in the north has been falling away, and that does very much tie in with the lack of recording. And then we've seen a major kick up this year, which has seen a little tick up in the trailing average, which will, of course, as we get rid of those very low years of 18, 19, 20, we'll start, I hope, to see a rise back up to previous levels. In the south, I always thought it was interesting that there was this big dip in 2017, but we've seen a steady rise upwards since then. So it's, as I say, it'd be interesting to see how this turns out in the long term. It could go either way. If we break that down into the smaller areas, just as we did with the record numbers, again, what we've got there is in the first column of data, we've got the range, the most and the highest number and the least number of species seen in those 3 years in those areas, the 2021 figure, and then the change compared to the highest figure of those 3 years. So, for instance, Lancashire, that 31% represents the change from 52, which was the highest number in 2018-20, through to 68 in 2021. That's the 31%. And then we've got what the highest number actually recorded since in the last since 2003 in that right hand column. And you'll see that quite a lot of these columns, we are nowhere near the maximum number, even with this increase of information available. Two peaks, Grassington, it's the highest number we've seen recorded, 112 species in the Grassington area, and 113 in the Bolton Abbey area, probably reflecting that 300% increase in the actual amount of records. But you'll see that, for instance, in the Washburn, it's actually lower, and it's lower than 136 was last year's figure. So we're actually 2 figures down. And I think that just shows that some areas are particularly well birded. Washburn attracts a lot of enthusiastic and committed and knowledgeable birders, and you can see that. Otley Wetland, interestingly, has been seeing a steady rise over the last 2 or 3 years after a fall away, but still not up to the highest number of 113 in 2004. So if we briefly look at the number of species recorded at 60 or more sites, which is sort of some cut off, and I use that figure totally arbitrarily because it represented about the top dozen or so species for the last few years, you'll see that that's a huge increase this year, and we actually had 23, double any previous year that I've done this thing for in the last decade or so. And if we look at this, species at most locations, what we've got there is the top 10 or so birds in terms of how many locations. We have standardized locations and how many locations these birds are seen, species are seen. First column of data is the 2021 figure. Second column of data is last year's with the position in brackets. And what I found interesting doing this was actually relatively how little the order of things changed. The curlew has for quite some time been the most widely spread bird reported bird that we have, buzzard second for the second year. There have been some changes, but and some have dropped down a bit. But actually, when you look at it, what it really shows is what we're getting is more data for each bird. Some are being more reported, and I think particularly that we're getting more in from upland birds. And of course, partly because those have been the least reported in the past. A couple of birds at the bottom, those 4 birds in blue were all in the top 10 last year, and I just included them to show where they relatively finished. And although it looks like, I mean, like for instance, the Willow Warbler has dropped away dramatically from 5th to 17th. If you actually look, it's still shown an increase. It's just that numbers are very, very compressed, and a slight change with 1 or 2 species will change positions dramatically. So what we're actually seeing with this data is certain areas better covered, we're seeing more depth, and we're seeing more birds showing up, getting a better reflection of maybe of their geographical spread. Actually, talking about specific species, what was seen, this is a list of all the birds seen this year that were not seen in 2020. And heading the list is the photographed bird, the great northern diver, which appeared at Knotford Nook at the end of the juvenile, appeared at the end of last year and crept into this year, so it will actually appear in next year's review as well. But that's the first one we've had in Wharfedale since the last century. Other birds, all those numbers in brackets are the last year that the species appeared on our list, and you'll see there's a fair chunk at the bottom which actually were only missing last year. But some have been longer term. Water pipit, not for 20 odd years, a couple of waders for a dozen years or so. And some of those, no doubt, were BTO records, but actually a lot were not. A lot are down to the regular birders who contribute records. What wasn't seen this year, topping the list for me, has to be the pochard in the photograph. Only the second year I can see on record that the pochard has not appeared, and we'll be looking at this a little bit in more detail later, so I won't linger on it. Pintail, not spotted redshank. A lot of these birds only appeared last year. They were one-offs. The pochard for me is the most significant of those that's actually fallen away. A couple of causes for concern, possibly. These are the birds, these are the 5 species where, in spite of the increase in data, we are still seeing the number of locations fallen away. So the goldeneye was actually only seen at 4 locations this year, as opposed to the 6 for the previous 2 years. Strong at Otley Wetland and Knotford Nook, but pretty fragile everywhere else, and only seen once at Chelker and once up at Swinsty, for instance. Hobby had a big tick up last year, dropped away this year to lower than the year before, but that may just be variations. Long-eared owl has seen a steady decline and was only seen at 1 location last year. Sedge warbler, again, dropping away, only 3 locations. Really mainly its stronghold at Otley Wetland. The others were very much passing records. And the reed warbler, again, only at Otley Wetland last year. So maybe some cause for concern there with those 5. Look a little bit more at the goldeneye in a few minutes. So that's my review of the records. What about a little bit, just couple of topics that I want to, and I may have to race through this in order to achieve my half hour. What about the couple of topics? Well, the first one I thought I would look at is summer migrant arrival dates. These really won't be affected very much by the BTO data. Most of these summer migrants are seen first of all in the south, Most of the early records, looking back through this year's records, were actually recorded by members or on the local birding groups, didn't come through the BTO data. So I think this is something that we can actually look at a year on year, because so much we're going to have to I'm going to have to really think about. So to start with, we're going to look at just some of the summer migrants and see if there's actually been any changes over the last few years in terms of their arrival dates. And the first has to be the hirundines. And if you look at this graph, what this shows is since the year 2006, it's from the year 2006, years along the bottom. I know that the last little bit's been hidden, but each marker is one more year. And up the side are the number of days after March the 1st. So, for instance, San Martins in 2006 arrived on the 16th of March, swallows on about the 28th of March, and the house martins just into April, by April 2nd. And what you can see, therefore, as the graphs progress, is a distinct increase in the time after March 1st. In other words, the hirundines are definitely, or seem to have been over the last 16 years, seen a steady increasing lateness in their arrival. Seems to have been a big kick up in the early 2010s, between 2011 and 14. And there was one very particularly late year in 2016 when, for instance, the swallows didn't arrive till day 52, which is well almost into May. But what you can also see, again with the swallows, that as sorry, what I should have said is these figures are the average arrival date for the previous. No, these are the actual arrival dates for those days. So you can see that the change creeping forward. If you actually if we move on to some of the other species, what we're seeing here are swift cuckoo and willow warbler. Willow warbler has again seen a steady increase, a bit similar to the hirundines, as have the swift. And again, we had a particularly late year around about 2016. We've seen a couple of dips as well, and it's flattened out a bit and steadied out the last couple of these. What I found particularly interesting is the one that so many people love to record the first date is the cuckoo, is how surprisingly consistent it has been in its arrival date. And it has stayed pretty steady throughout this time. If we take a look at the actual figures, we can see that San Martins, we've got the earliest dates that arrival, the latest dates of arrival, and then the mean date of arrival for the first 3 years, and the mean date of arrival for the first 4 years, and the mean date of arrival over the last 4 years. So what we're actually seeing there in the last column is the difference between the average of those first 4 years in 2003-06 and the average over 2017 to 2021. And what we can see there are some significant differences with most of these species. I've done a quick run through. They are statistically significant in their difference. So San Martins, almost a fortnight later, they're averaging in the last 4 years. Swallows, almost 5 days later. Willow warblers, bang on 5 days later. House martins, almost a week later. And swifts, just over a week later. The one species that seems to have stayed pretty consistent throughout is the cuckoo, with an earliest arrival date of April the 15th and a latest arrival date of April 28th, so a mere fortnight spread compared to some of the almost month-wide spreads of some of the other birds. But I think what that shows is that we are seeing, at least with these species, we are seeing a distinct shift in the arrival dates. What will be very interesting is to see what happens this year, not least of which is because I saw today that Willow Warbler has actually just been recorded this morning at Eckert Reservoir and reported as the earliest arrival there since 1963. So it will be interesting to see if some of these figures might, whether this is a temporary increase or whether we shall see some depression of those figures. So anyway, that's a view of arrivals. The other topic I wanted to have a quick look at were ducks in Wharfedale. I have a particular love of ducks, and I can spend hours even watching mallards. But again, they are in areas that are well covered, well reported. So comparative stuffs can still be, I think, valuably looked at, even if some of the data this year has changed significantly. So here we have the total number of duck species seen in Wharfedale in the last 21 years since the turn of the century. 23 species, including 2 that are ruddy duck, which has now been virtually extirpated, and wood duck, which probably goes down as an exotic anyway. And I've split them into three areas: those that are resident or frequent visitors in large numbers, those similar but in smaller numbers, and those are scarce around. That's because of the analysis I've done. I've also, as part of the analysis I've done here, I've included coot. I've not done any analysis work on mallard. The figures we're looking at are just too disparate and too messy, and I need to have a more detailed look to see if we can extract anything useful for them. But some of the other species we can. And some of this stems from the fact that my predecessor, John Flood, once commented that he felt that in the review, he felt that as useful as any sighting numbers or location numbers, the largest flock sizes were an indicator, a good indicator of healthy population or not within an area. So what I've done with ducks is have a look at both their location and flock sizes. This is a graph of the number of species per year since the turn of the century, and as you can see, the red line is a 5-year trailing average. You can see that's a pretty steady downward trend, with just a slight blip up in the last few years, but nothing compared to the numbers that we were getting at the turn of the century, which I think is worth bearing in mind. So if we look at the dabblers, the common dabblers, the ones that we see in larger numbers, if we look at the location of the top graph, you can see that since 2003, the earliest figure we got for locations, numbers have been pretty steadily rising for mandarin, and they're now up to 35 locations compared to the 5 or 6 at early on in the century. Teal and widgeon are much more stable. They fluctuate a little bit, but they're generally stable. They are slightly higher this year than they were in 2003. Even the slight low last year wasn't much. I think we can see that in locational terms, their populations are pretty stable. When you look at flock size, the widgeon particularly has seen a steady increase with a huge gathering in 2019, which I think was at Otley Wetland. Whereas the flock sizes for the teal and the mandarin fluctuate much more. Mandarin, apparently, so I've been told by people far better informed than me, is to some extent influenced by the amount of beech mast available for food for the autumn gatherings, when the mandarin actually do gather much more than any other time of the year. So basically what we're probably seeing is certainly stable and maybe even tendering to slightly larger populations. Slightly different in terms of divers, and what we're seeing here, it's a more of a mixed message. I said goldeneye might be of concern, and you can see in the location graph how goldeneye have fallen away from over 20 locations in 2010 to the mere 4 that were seen at last year. what less dramatic, but maybe a long-term birders will have definitely noticed is the fall away in pochard numbers. And as I said, this year is only the second year that we've seen none at all. Tufties, on the other hand, into locational terms anyway, number of locations seem to be on the rise and have hit the highest that we've had in this century. Slightly different for them in terms of flock sizes, they have been down. So what we can see with the tufties is maybe more widespread, at least recorded more widespread, but flock sizes and actual populations in any one place not as high as they have been. Goldeneye, on the other hand, is the opposite way around. Locations down, but the flock size is up. So maybe, well, hopefully, a concentration at their two strongholds at Wetland and at Knotford Nook. And as for the pochard, well, as I say, any long-term bird in this area will know. For me, as someone who's come into birding in Wharfedale fairly late, I've barely seen pochard. I've only seen once on Otley Wetland. They were common back in the 2000s and regularly seen with flock sizes of 40 or more. So a change in terms of diving, which to some extent, certainly with pochard and goldeneye, definitely reflects national trends and the lack of birds coming over and migrating from the continent on a national basis. If we look at coot, I wanted to include them because the numbers, someone commented to me, I do bird Knotford Nook fairly regularly for the Wetland Bird Survey and don't often get huge numbers. And I was talking to a much more regular, long-term regular birder who said, well, there used to be hundreds on Knotford Nook. Knotford Nook regularly produces the maximum flock size for coot. And as you can see on the bottom graph, that number has, as my friend identified, fallen away dramatically. Flocks of over 300-400 in 2000, 2002, down to less than 50 in the last couple of years. Locations have been falling away this year. Maybe that is part of the BTO input of data, but we've seen I haven't done any real analysis on that number, but starting to maybe it's not quite as, I hold on to the fact it may not be quite as dire as that, but if you look at the previous to that, the locations were falling away quietly. So coot in not a great state in our area. Other species, what I've done here, rather than try to do any graphing or anything for them, because the numbers just don't warrant it, I've split the 2000 to 2021 into 3/3, the last third being the slightly longer by 1 year. And what you can see with those is, as the overall record numbers show, numbers have been creeping downwards. Gargany, Pintail, in particular, were used to appear quite regularly. Pintail 12 years out of 14 for the first part of this century, only once in the last 8 years. Others have creeping down, shoveler, scaup, common scoter, all creeping down. Eider, long-tailed, very much, just seen in the very early years and then not been seen since. So the sawbill, smew and merganser sort of fairly steady and fairly, just sort of up, intermittent on a fairly random basis. Goosander population, incidentally, looking fairly strong and solid. So what we're actually looking at overall in overall terms, maybe is that Mallard, which I haven't examined here, but the figures. So as you'll have seen from the population, the early one, Mallard, one of the 8 most widely spread birds in our patch. Mallard, mandarin and widgeon stable, probably extending. Mandarin certainly extent banding, widgeon possibly. Tufted, teal and goosander looking stable. Goldeneye and coot, probably a concern, hopefully not the same way as pochard. Goldeneye being influenced by similar climatic issues. Coot, numbers on Knotford may well be influenced by the increasing amount of angling and the change of use of knock for knock, but hopefully not going the same way as potshot, but definitely of concern. Shelduck and Gadwal, which I didn't really covered, but have actually been very stable. And actually, the last couple of years, we've seen tick-ups in terms of their distribution in numbers, particularly of Gadwal, where up to 14, 15 birds have been seen both at Otley Wetland and at Knotford Knock on occasions. And others perhaps at best saying too intermittent to call, but maybe we're seeing fewer rare species. So basically, two very, very quick summaries of two topics, which I hope were of interest, that derive with the data derived, but not maybe too impacted by the involvement of the BTO material. That will obviously carry on now. We'll have more BTO material, and that will now stabilize there. And I am planning to go back over the last couple of years and fully integrate data so that we will start to be able to look at trends fairly soon again, but actually related to the bigger numbers. In the meantime, really just to finish off and say, please do continue sending records in. Thank you, a huge thank you to the people who do contribute, some who contribute a phenomenal amount, and for which I am extremely grateful. If you do contribute to the BTO, please at least drop me a line and let me know. I won't ask you to send me records directly. That is actually by far and away the most efficient and easiest way for me to acquire the data from you. But please don't be put off if you don't use BirdTrack. Please don't be put off by sending me data, sending me information. Drop me a line. That's my email address. It is also on the Wharfedale Nats website, and I will be happy to discuss with you any way of which sending me the data that makes it easy for you and easy for me. But really just to finish off and say thank you very much and thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Massive amount of life brought to the data there, and a huge amount of data. So some fascinating stuff from there. We've run over a bit, but just a couple or three quick questions, if we may.
All right, yes.
To what extent are garden records important or valuable to your data?
Very good question. I didn't include the garden stuff this year because I was trying to, include that other material, but about 25 to 30%. And what's really important about garden records is that's the very stuff that doesn't normally get recorded or reported. The BTO data, I don't have access to the garden birdwatch data. So given the extent of the settlements, very, very valuable indeed. Yeah, very valuable.
Thank you. And then on the arrival dates, I was absolutely staggered that things are arriving later when you'd think, spring's earlier and all that information. I'll definitely be out looking for sand martins on the beach tomorrow. But, is that likely to be causing issues of if there are insects emerging earlier with warmer starts to the year sometimes and the birds still coming later?
I think the whole disjunction could be really, really challenging, whichever way around it is. I think that there could be real problems.
And do those later arrival dates here reflect other regional data in the UK?
I think so. I mean, I hadn't had a chance to look in great depth at the stuff, but basically I looked at that partly because I was reading about the fact that birds were arriving later or seem to be shifting later, and I thought, well, I'd like to see how it actually works out in our own patch. It seems to, I hadn't realized how dramatic some of those were going to be there. I have to say I expected shifts of 1 or 2 days, but not like a whole week since the century turn. Be interesting to see if that carries on.
Yeah, and with the southerlies coming up just now, we'll see who's on.
Exactly. Yeah.
But, thanks, Andrew. I'll pass back to Peter just to sum up.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Andrew. I think that presentation does show why Andrew is such an effective bird recorder for us. Very thorough, very professional, and very interesting in terms of the trends that he was able to show. And we are indebted to him. Of course, he produced all that on top of the annual review, which takes an awful lot of his time, as you can imagine, with all the data that he gets in. So a really good way to end our AGM, and thank you very much again, Andrew, for a very thorough and enjoyable presentation. So I think I don't need to hand back to Jeff. I think that's probably the end of the evening. Thank you all for joining in. Can I just remind you, though, that there is one more webinar to come on April the 5th. Bridget Strawbridge, who has a bit of a national reputation as far as bees are concerned, because she has written a book about them, which has sold extremely well. I've seen the presentation, which is why we booked her for Wharfedale Naturalists, and it will be a great evening. Again, it will be our last one for this winter season. It is unusually late, but I hope you'll hang on and I hope you will tune in. So thank you again to everyone, and I hope to see you in a fortnight's time, and I do hope you enjoy the summer as well with Wharfedale Naturalists. Okay, thank you and goodbye.